Hi, my name is Dr. Murray Dick. I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University in the UK, and my contribution to this year's conference is going to be titled Exploring the Ethics of Mapping Displaced People at the Local Knowledge Exhibition. So, where does this project arise from? Well, it's a response to an annual survey that Ipsos Mori do every year called Perils of Perception. And this is an international survey which shows that the public, by and large, are really quite at variance with the lived experience around them. People tend, on average, to misjudge issues like population demographics of the area or the country they live in. They tend to assume that the wider public is less happy than is the case. They tend to assume that public is less tolerant than is the case, and they generally tend to assume that wealth is more evenly distributed than is the case. So, really, this is an attempt to say, is it possible that we can use visual communication, which has become so important in today's culture? Is it possible that we can use visual communication to address this misperception? And the format that these visual communicative forms take is what I call the local knowledge exhibition. And this refers back to a paper that I wrote towards the end of last year, the beginning of this year. It's coming out later this year. And it's to do with a construct that I call the local knowledge exhibition. And this is an idea that you can put together infographics and data visualizations in a narrative, in a story form, in a public space. And you can use the tools of theatre and the tools of storytelling in order to effectively and convincingly tell the story about a local area through its data in embodied forms. And so, really, this is drawing on traditions in the field of data visualization that go back to the likes of Joseph Priestley, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Otto Neurath. Okay, so I've got a general proposition, and it's this. An effective and ethical use of visual storytelling will make data visualizations more engaging, more memorable, and perhaps more likely to affect change in how people perceive data following discussion with their peers at the knowledge exhibition. So, the sorts of properties, storytelling properties that this particular exhibition will involve are things like a rebirth. So this goes back to the idea, Christopher Brooker idea, that there are 7 essential plots. One plot is the rebirth. That's the idea of changing your ways. So the entire visual storyline is organized around the idea of rebirth. There is a setting, which is in North Jesmond in Newcastle. There are characters, both representational characters that are depicted on the posters and obviously interactive characters, which is the visitors to the exhibition. There's a point of view, which is that of a local resident. There is conflict about some of the misunderstandings that exist around certain demographic realities in the local area. And there's a genre as well, and I refer to this as a genteel type of theatre that people would enjoy. Okay, so on the left, you can see the venue as was. This is a single room at the top of the Armstrong building in Newcastle University. It's a purpose-built exhibition space, small exhibition space. It's big enough to house 20 A2 size posters. The posters are arranged and people are encouraged to navigate themselves clockwise from left as they enter the room. The source material comes from census maps and other commentary, but also pictures, a series of pictures of the built environment around North Jesmond, some landmarks that people like immediately identify with, and hopefully we'll get them to think a little bit about the data that's presented in those forms. And so really this is an ongoing project. It started really only about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So we're still in the early stages. Now, why am I talking about the mapping of displaced people? Well, as you can appreciate, most of the data that we've looked at so far is of a statistical nature. It's to do with how the local authority and the local area is organized. But what we found, obviously, as many areas of Europe have recently, that local areas up and down the country in the UK are seeing numbers of Ukrainian refugees appear since the invasion by Russia. And so this is becoming part of the narrative. And this, it seemed to me that this could be a really sort of valuable story to explore within the local exhibition. And around about, a good few months ago, going back into last year actually, I found that there was quite a heated debate around the representation of displaced people from Ukraine in the news maps and the cartography that were being circulated at the time. And this is a fairly classic example, actually. You can see it. There's an arrow or a series of arrows emanating from Ukraine to the bordering countries. And really, this started an ethical discussion amongst cartographers with this sort of following things in mind. There is some opinion that arrows are not an appropriate way to represent displaced people during a time of war. And this is an idea really that's been floating around for a very long time. It goes back to the 90s and earlier. And there's a number of reasons for this, and I'm just going to go through them very quickly here. So they tend to dramatize news stories, which obviously isn't always a good thing. They are associated with propaganda and propaganda in the past, although other less, shall we say, controversial forms are also associated with propaganda, like circles, so we have to be careful of that. They use an inappropriate scale, that is to say, a single arrow indicating the flow of large numbers of people is perhaps not the best way of sort of scaling that reality up. They can be seen as a dehumanizing metaphor. So, again, the idea of people as a mere arrow. They can have attached meanings, and especially to do with the symbolism of colors used, such as red as signifying danger, as blue as signifying a flood. And of course, these can be hugely damaging ideas to attach to vulnerable people fleeing war. But the key problem really is that they use the same visual language that's often used to show the invading forces as well. So this is a problem. In addition to that, there are three further kind of sub problems here. One is that they're not very good at conveying uncertainty. Arrows are quite a kind of propositional, shall we say, graphical form. They don't do well at conveying the sense of uncertainty that clearly exists here because, of course, people were moving back and forth across these various borders. They communicate a sense of causality without necessarily showing the causal agent, in this case, the invading Russian forces. And lastly, they wrongly imply a degree of agency in movement. So if you think about it, if you see an arrow representing Ukrainian people moving, you kind of get the impression that they are doing so completely free of their own will, whereas we know that the reality is that people are often forced into these circumstances by responsibilities to dependents and so on and so forth. However, there were some alternatives to the arrows, and I wanted to look at two in particular. This is one that was produced by Alan Smith at the Financial Times. The second one I want to show is this one, which was produced by a cartographer called Ken Field. And they're both very different. They're both very different maps. They represent information. They represent displaced people in very different ways. And it got me thinking: is there something that unites these two very different maps in some sort of thematic way? And this is what I came up with. What it occurs to me is that both of these maps, in their own way, represent a form of liminality. Okay, and that's liminality is an anthropological concept that arises from the idea that spaces where or processes whereby transition from one status, say a citizen, to another, say a refugee or a displaced person, is experienced. Okay, so liminality is that experience. And if you think about these two map forms, they both, in their own ways, kind of embody that sense of liminality. So the Ken Fields one at the top, the idea of disintegration or disintegrating borders is a liminal spatial metaphor. And the one below, the FT map, corridors, these sort of non-arrow type shapes, they look a little like corridors to me. And so corridors also are a liminal spatial metaphor. Okay, and the great thing about both of these options, alternatives to arrows, is that they allow the building of uncertainty into the visual grammar of what you're looking at. Okay, so my method in this research is framed in the first place by post-critical positionality. Okay, so I'm not coming here with a critical mindset. Indeed, I want to find out what the thoughts of the cartographers who make these maps are. And so that's my starting point. I'm going to start with the mackers, the people who actually make these things. So I've undertaken 3 interviews with academic cartographers so far, and I've started to establish a thematic analysis of the interview data that I have generated. The themes that I've identified so far include things like to do with formats. So the FT diagram, the second one you saw, seems to work because it is essentially a flow diagram overlaid on a map. So actually, it's not a map per se, it's actually a diagram. The second theme is to do with definitions. Okay, so from conversations with these 3 cartographers, it's very clear that relatively tight definition of the liminal will be necessary, or it will be hard to operationalize in the practice of cartographic design. And the third theme that I want to mention is to do with purpose. The disintegrating design by Ken Field, it suggested, would not likely work as a news map because news audiences would just not be in a position to deal with such a, I guess, an unusual and a complex kind of visual representation of the story. Okay, so to conclude, some of the theoretical strands that I'm trying to draw together to try and sort of solidify this research idea. The first is to do with national identity. The idea of national identity, I'm going to argue, is embodied and effective, and it's not simply an imagined community after Benedict Anderson. The second thing I wanted to raise is the idea of sovereignty in the field of international relations, and this is the idea that sovereign border lines act as a liminal border space. And the third theme that I want to, or the third strand that I want to draw together is to do with media mapping as a form of hospitality, which is an idea that emerges from the field of media studies and the work of Roger Silverstone. So to conclude, my aim is to inform ethical discussion in fields of cartography and news mapping about the use of liminality in mapping uncertainty. And lastly, I hope that my new designs may contribute to a new dimension in the knowledge exhibition in my project up in Armstrong Building at Newcastle. Thanks for listening.